3 of Heidegger's logic. Uh, Welcome back to this video. And section 3 is about scholastic logic, and Heidegger really goes berserk in a way and is very rhetorical. In the very first paragraph, he'll say that scholastic logic is a form of fraud kept alive by custom and by off the record academic arrangements and desires, and it is also a fraud. Now, we haven't spent the last several months working through scholastic logic as Heidegger would have done in his education, where he was trained probably by those bearing rulers and whips on learning some things as what Stephen was presenting in the second video. But scholastic logic can be very dry and very boring. And so that's partly what Heidegger is responding to.
Right. So if you think about the logic in the second video with the moods and the figures and the 256 different types of syllogisms, and it's this tradition of teaching it in a very mathematical and formal way that I feel like Heidegger is trying to rail against here. I mean, his language is really strong, and he's saying that this is a fraud perpetrated on students on page 9. They are trapped for a whole semester studying stuff of utterly dubious value. It would be easier and more expeditious for them, not to mention quicker and cheaper, just to read the stuff on their own in any logical manual.
And you might feel this way about this class, is that you could just read this stuff on your own, as you're mostly doing. Why do you need a teacher? And part of the online element of this class means you don't even have the meanness that Heidegger would have experienced in his own life of a professor standing there lecturing on logic for an hour or two every day, as maybe some of you did with math in high school or junior high. You may have had boring math teachers, perhaps, so you may be able to imagine what he's talking about. But in your own comments or feedback to this, what do you think about this sentence? Students are trapped for a whole semester studying stuff of utterly dubious value. Do you feel like university education has some of this? And of course, Heidegger making a book on logic, one might think that this would be a lecture course according to that scholastic tradition, and he's not doing that.
Right. I mean, we've tried to not do that so much as well. I mean, we could have spent weeks on, argument structures and syllogisms and truth tables. But like I've said so many times now, that's not how we actually think. And we've never really thought that way. And then the more complete, or what Heidegger is going to call the philosophizing logic, is this more complete view of what truth is and how we're going to talk about truth in our philosophy.
So studying scholastic logic, according to page 12, teaches you how to think and helps you reach a higher level of learning and a greater exactitude in thinking. So as much as he rails and uses all of this rhetoric that's a fraud and whatever, he actually was trained in it and will use it to some extent. So while he's not purely or truly a scholastic in the way that he does logic, he does, however, think it has a point. It's just didn't need to be taught to students in the way that he received it.
But Heidegger's not trying to get us to do away with scholastic logic and the tradition completely. He's just saying that we need to recognize its limitations. In fact, he says one of the things that is good for is on page 12, before the 3 asterisks, he's talking about it's a fool's errand to expect the traditional logic will teach us how to think. But on the other hand, we certainly can clarify scientific work and academic study. In a word, the whole form of existence that they encompass, but only by way of a philosophizing logic. So he's saying that when it comes to academics, especially sciences, there are things that this logic, especially the way he wants to understand truth, will clarify and help us understand. In fact, he gives a list on page 13 of 9 things um, that he thinks logic can help us garner about the sciences.
And while these 9 things sound confusing or difficult, he is trying to clarify in a similar way to what scholastic logic did, a way of achieving or capturing truth through language. And all these components, all 9 of them, get modified according to the different sciences and groups of sciences. So without going through all 9 of them, the point is to achieve some kind of clarity.
Right, so maybe take a look at those. Definitely on page 13, there's this list of things that you should really consider whenever you think about designating one science from another, even, such as the subject matter, the way the subject matter is selected. Take a look at those. So at the end of the section, he concludes by talking about the central concern of a philosophizing logic, and that is what is truth.
However, there is, just before the end, where he says one of the most important factors of this is to be able to admit one's errors, the possibility of even making mistakes. He writes on page 14, the courage to err, or err, does not mean just the courage to put up with one's errors. It means much more. The courage to admit one's errors. It is courage for the inner release of one's own self in order to listen and learn, the courage for positive discussion. This was not a category in previous views of logic, to admit one's mistakes.
Right. In fact, if you remember my talking about certainty so much in the first couple of videos, I mean, that's kind of the same critique is, we aren't looking for certainty because we need the courage to admit when there is no certainty or when mistakes have been made, not only by our reasoning, but in the scholastic or collegiate tradition that he's trying to critique. In section 4, Heidegger talks about skepticism, mostly in regards to truth. And on page 15, after this long quote, he gets at the heart of the matter of this section. And that is, before the question of what truth is, there comes the question of whether it is at all. Before sketching out what it is, we have to prove that it is. So here, he's trying to take a step backwards in what he's done so far with the questions of truth that we've already raised in the reading, and say, well, I mean, there's some people that are skeptical of the concept of truth. And in this section, he tries to attack that skepticism and lay out an argument for why truth is in fact a reality, even if it's the question of how tangible it is still up for grabs.
And interestingly enough, skeptics have always existed. So in the ancient Greek world, there were skeptics. At the time of Plato and Aristotle, for example, there were skeptics, and in the beginning of science as well, 16th, 17th centuries, during the scientific revolution, people questioned, the sun is not the center of the solar system. That would be ridiculous. And some disagreed with what was absolute dogma at the time. Even nowadays, in the 21st century, some are skeptical of truth or facts.
Right, and especially in this postmodern world we're living in now, where alternative facts are a thing, there's a definitely a attention that needs to be paid to this question, and Heidegger's attack of the skeptical view.
And logic as a discipline, even along with the two things we talked about in the previous video, ethics and nature, or a science of ethics and nature, logic is an attempt to get at this truth without being blinded by skepticism.
So his attack on skepticism begins on page 17 and 18, and he lays out 5 arguments or attacks against the whole idea of skepticism. And the first one is based on the idea, I mean, these are very complex and complicated arguments, but so to try kind of in vain to simplify them, the first one is based on the idea that truth is about propositional truth. I mean, we discussed this in the past, but he's saying that the question of the skeptic, or one way to attack the skeptic, is with the understanding that truth is not just about propositions and propositional truth.
And the second ties to the first, especially in the sense of the principle of non-contradiction, and that is, in order to prove something, you have to ask why prove anything at all, and why.
Right, just like a little kid asks why over and over again. And it's because they're searching for what makes it provable, or what gives it the quality of provability. So in the third attack, he talks again about the principle of contradiction, and the question of whether the things we assume to be self-evident actually are self-evident ultimately. But then in the fourth attack, he says, as long as we're saying there is truth, then in a sense, the fact that we can say there is gives it a sense of being beyond skepticism. There has to be something there for us to be talking about it.
And lastly, to tie into this, he looks into this notion of self-evident. What is self-evident? The more noise one makes about the self-evident, the more puzzles there are to solve. But philosophizing requires us to hunt down and look into this, what is or immediately self-evident things. And for that, we need the right direction and the crucial light for finding our way.
And speaking of crucial light for finding our way, so the rest of the course is going to be based on the paper topics that you chose. So rather than try to tackle this whole work, we're going to go through it and pick out some reading assignments that go along with the themes of the paper topics you've chosen.
So look for that soon.
Thank you.